We're back to topic 4 today, but before we get into topic 4, I have a couple of things that I want to talk about. So the big reminder, of course, is that test number 2 is on Monday. This is the exact same information that I gave you before. Except for it's not today's lecture. Okay, it's the first few slides on last day's lecture. So up until, but not including E. coli. So for anybody who wants to know, so some of the introductory stuff in terms of, symptoms of waterborne diseases and things like that. But most of it's going to be on the chemistry, probably 2 to 3 marks max on the water biology. The big one is that you do the water analysis question. So do make sure that you go over the problems that I have in the problem sets. Okay, I have them posted on Moodle. I'm going to be basing my questions off of those problems, and that's going to be at least half of the marks are going to be calculations around those problems. So make sure that you can do those. So the other one I wanted to give you is, so I returned yesterday your report number 1. So you can access that on Moodle and download your grade and your comments. So please take a look at those. And if you have any questions, let me know. But I had kind of some general feedback on the reports. One is that your report should be professional. Okay, so do make sure you do format it nice and make sure it's readable. This is kind of the expectation, is that you're in college now, so you should be looking at making things that are, you'd be submitting to an employer someday, and an employer is going to only want your report to be professional and well put together. Another tip for people is research your answers. A number of people seem to want to just answer the discussion questions without giving it a lot of thought or any research or things like that. At a minimum, read what the lab manual says. For example, there was a question in there about why we had to calibrate the EDTA solution. It's right out of the 3rd page in the lab manual. It talks about how the solution is complex with water, and when you weigh it, you don't know exactly how many moles you have, etc. Okay. A lot of people were just giving me answers that they just made up out of their heads. This isn't grade 9 anymore. We want to have a good college level answer, which means a little bit of research, look at the lab manual, maybe do a quick Google, and that's kind of what I'm expecting. Another one is always be specific when answering things. With your objectives or answering your questions, you can see I have 2 examples there, right, about being specific to determine the hardness of various water samples. That's not bad. It's just not giving me everything that I'd like to know. You can see B, it's actually listing the water samples. Now, obviously, if you had 30 water samples, you're not going to list that in a sentence, but there might be some theme around the water samples from the Athabasca River, or water samples from the Wood Buffalo region, or something like that. So always be specific. It's very important. You want your reader to be able to read what you have written and understand, and not have any guesswork, nothing vague. Another one is people seem to have varying abilities to be able to make these special characters. And I'm going to actually show you how to do them right now. But take a look at this, right? This sentence here that I've written. 50 microliters of 25 molar. And then what is that? Right? It's actually carbonate, right? 25 degrees Celsius. It is really not very hard to do those special characters. So what I'm going to do is show you how to do that right now. I just exited that. Looks like I may have to reshare my screen. Just give me a second here. And what I'm going to do is just share my screen like this. Okay, so you can see I'm in PowerPoint here, and you can see there's a few things, right? So special characters. Now notice this here is microliter. So the special micro is actually something that looks like this, right? So I can make that character in Word, and actually very easy to do so. If you go up here to insert, so this is at the top of the screen. If you look over here, on the right-hand side, it says symbols. So if I click that down, there's an equation option or a symbol option. So in this case here, I'm going to click on symbol, And in fact, you can actually see here, I have a lot of the common symbols that I've used already apparently. So micro is in there, so I can select that and do that. I can hit insert, I'm not gonna hit insert yet, but there's options for all sorts of symbols. If you scroll down on this, you can see there's all sorts of Greek symbols and mathematical symbols and all sorts of other things. You can change the font. Some of the special fonts have special symbols into it. So in this case here, I can just click on the symbol I want, hit insert, and then I can hit close. And then there's my special symbol. Okay, so what about this here, this carboxylate, right? So what I want is a subscript for that. So if I go over here to home, there are ways to make the buttons automatically appear up here. I've done that on my settings for my Word. In PowerPoint, if you don't have it set up in Word, you can just hit this font expansion. Okay, and then a subscript means it's going to be a little small letter like that. And then the charge is, of course, a superscript. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go up here to font, and I'm going to hit superscript. There, doesn't that look way better than what I had before? Same things with the degrees Celsius. I can just make that a superscript. There is actually a special degree symbol, but I just use a small letter O and make a superscript of it. And it's much, much more readable. And it's more professional. And really, this is what is expected in this class, is that you do have professional looking reports. Okay, so I'm just going to put that back to full screen again. I think I accidentally unshared it. Now let me try that again. Share screen. Here we go. Okay, so those are just some general tips. I'll probably give you a few more tips leading up into the next report or two, but there's just a few to get you started. Do take a look at your report and give me some feedback. If you have any questions, I can give you some feedback on your specific report. So back to water biology, we were talking about waterborne diseases, but what I'm going to do is actually skip down here to D, because it's related to what we're doing in the lab. If you remember last week, we were going to measure biochemical oxygen demand, and we started doing that. We had those little tubes. You may remember one had aquarium water and the other had wastewater in it. So I figured I should talk about that first so that you have a little bit better of an idea of what that is in the lab. So biochemical oxygen demand, sometimes I've seen also called biological oxygen demand, but most people call it biochemical oxygen demand. And so this is basically, this is a measure that is looking at the amount of organic carbon that is in a sample. So if you think about all the pollution activities that might be out there, your water sample could have fertilizer in it, it could have pesticides, it could have fecal matter, it could have food, it could have decaying plants, it could be organic matter, could be from a pulp and paper mill, so wood chips, right? Millions of potential things, right? So organic matter is an idea of really how much pollution in some ways a water sample is, right? Particularly measuring organics. And so this is kind of a really rough and dirty way to do it. And you can see in my notes there, it's talking about there's sometimes people call it carbonaceous biochemical oxygen demand, but that's actually a slightly different test and protocol. We're just going to talk about biochemical oxygen demand. So I guess I said this already. This is the strength of organics in a wastewater, and it's not measuring them directly. It's more an indirect kind of measure. And so if you think about it, all these organics are in there, and usually these sample waters are, it's going to break down eventually. But here's the thing: is most of these wastewaters have bacteria in them, and so really this biochemical oxygen demand is really basically looking at how much oxygen is consumed. So how much O2 consumed by bacteria is really what it is. And here's the thing, is the standard is we do this over 5 days. So sometimes it's better to understand this if you take a look at the formula. So there's the formula. And this is basically exactly the same as what is in the manual. So you can see what you're looking at is the dissolved oxygen on day 1. So day 1 was last Thursday for us. And usually you go 5 days, but we're doing it 7 days, just a matter of convenience. And then you measure how much oxygen is in the water sample after 5 days. And so, you know, the oxygen is usually going to be decreased. And then you're doing a corrector in there, in that you're basically multiplying it by the volume of the bottle and divided by the amount of the wastewater. So in our samples, if I remember correctly, we had 10 milliliters of the water sample and 40 milliliters of just tap water, right? If I remember correctly. And then you fully saturate it and you see how much oxygen is consumed. And like I said, there's a volume corrector in there. And that's it. And you put it through this and you're going to get a value. And so what we did in our samples is we measured it using a dissolved oxygen probe. You can actually get these dedicated BOD bottles that will take the measurement on day 1 and automatically, exactly 5 days later, they take the measurement on day 5. So they're just dedicated bottles, but that's basically a dissolved oxygen meter that you're seeing on top of those bottles there. So here's some numbers, by the way. These are all heavily polluted waters. Our water samples would probably not reach these levels anywhere near. Ours will probably be like in the 50s kind of max, but you can see, give you an idea how polluted our water is compared to, say, sewage, or compared to brewery wastewater or laundry wastewater, and so on. So like I said, it's kind of a bit of an indirect measure, and all you're doing is comparing and saying, okay, the number is low, the number is high. How high is the number compared to wastewater or sewage or whatnot? And so it's a very cheap, very easy test to do. The only problem is it takes 5 days. So that's kind of what we were doing in the lab, and I just wanted to introduce it there. We'll do a quick calculation here to give it a try to understand what's going on. So you can see here, it says here we've got a sample of wastewater, and it tells you the size of the bottle, and it tells you what the initial and the 5-day measure is, right? So our formula is this, right? Our formula is BOD 5, because it's a 5-day measurement, and the formula is we take the dissolved oxygen, the initial dissolved oxygen minus the dissolved oxygen final. I should have put an equal sign there. And then this is multiplied by the volume of the bottle. So the volume bottle divided by the volume of the water sample. So this is, like I said, just a bit of crunching the numbers. So if we look at the numbers there, we have, let's see here, 8.2 minus 6.2 times 200 divided by 10 mils. So in this case here, the milliliters and milliliters will cancel out. And the units over here are parts per million. Parts per million, sorry for cramming that in there. Crunch this in my calculator, and I'm basically getting 8.2 minus 6.2, which is 2 times 200 divided by 10 times 20. So 2 times 20 is the final answer, and 2 times 20, of course, is 40 parts per million. And that's the answer I get down there. So this is like I said, most of the math for the rest of the course is basically very basic punching into formula kind of math. So 40 ppm, that's not too bad for wastewater. Compared to tap water, that's very bad. Tap water is basically 0. And of course, we don't want any pollution in tap water or drinking water. But like I said, it's a bit of a bar, a bit of a measure. It's very, very rough. There are other measurements for organic carbons. Another one that's getting a lot more common that you're starting to see at wastewater treatment plants is the CBOD. So C means carbonaceous, sorry. So what they do is they add a chemical in there that is, it's inhibiting the oxidation of non-carbon organics, right? So it's inhibiting nitrogen oxidation, such as ammonia and whatnot. And so therefore, the idea is you're getting more of an accurate measurement of just the carbonaceous molecules and ignoring things like ammonia, which can be a big contaminant in certain things like wastewater. But it's just, like I said, very similar test, just, one extra step in there. And I'm not going to be asking about that one on a test, for example. Sometimes we talk about chemical oxygen demand, and my goal was to eventually have a chemical oxygen demand test in the labs, just haven't gone around to it. This is a different test that usually takes, I think, potassium permanganate. It's a lot quicker. Actually, potassium dichromate, it says there. And it's the same idea. You have something that is interacting and reacting with the carbon, and you can get a measurement, at least an idea of roughly how much carbon is in there based on how many reagents you use. But same idea. You're getting an idea of how much organic carbon is in there. So hopefully that all makes sense. Biochemical oxygen demand, like I said, it's a little bit of just a number crunching to see how much oxygen is consumed, which is directly related to how much organic waste is in there. And like I said, it's a really cheap and easy test to do. And so it's become kind of a bit of an industry standard in the wastewater industry. All right, so hopefully that will be able to get you through lab 2. So lab 2, you have to take the measurements of those samples, and then you can write your report. And then we'll be working on lab 3 tomorrow, and I'll talk about lab 3 in the lab. Lab 3 is the big one. It's the longest one that probably is going to take most of the full 3 hours. And I'll go over the details when you arrive tomorrow. Okay, so last day we were talking about waterborne diseases, and we were starting to talk about the bacteria, and the big one on the list, of course, is E. coli. We started talking about E. coli and how there's some friendly E. colis and there's some pathogenic E. colis, and the pathogenic ones can cause diarrhea. It's the most common thing. And there was also that E. coli 0157, and that's the nasty one that comes from cow feces and can cause bloody diarrhea, and in some cases death. I think maybe I finished off on this slide here and mentioned Salmonella and Shigella. These things can cause different types of diarrhea, intestinal cramps, sometimes fever, and Shigella and Salmonella are maybe a little bit more associated with food contamination, but again, it's the same idea. You have fecal matter that's coming from a human or an animal, and it's getting in your food or it's getting in water, and it leads to gastrointestinal kind of issues, vomiting, and diarrhea. So lots of fun there. I'm sure anybody here who's had any kind of food poisoning, in many cases it's salmonella, and it is not fun. All right, so there's another bacterial organism that is worth mentioning. Some people don't even throw it into the same category as a waterborne disease, because you can see it says here it is not a drinking water disease. So what is this thing? This organism is called Legionella. And Legionella is associated with mists. So things like hot tubs, cooling towers for large buildings, anything where a mist can be made, and usually a mist associated with a hot water. So for some people, this basically means hot tubs. I was looking for a picture of a hot tub, by the way, and I saw this one. I have never seen this done before. I thought this was hilarious. I had no idea that people did back of the truck hot tubs, but looks like fun. Thought you might enjoy that picture. So like I said, you've got hot water, and the hot water is basically an incubator. And so this Legionella bacteria lives out in the environment, and it likes to live in warm water. And then the mist is how it gets spread. And so what happens is it gets spread and people inhale it, and then they get a lung infection. And so what you're getting is basically a pneumonia type disease. It has its own name. It's called Legionnaires Disease, named after the bacteria Legionella. Legionella, by the way, was named after some legionnaires. Legionnaires are people that belong to the Legion, right? So they're former military soldiers or something like that, right? And anyway, yeah, so this is a totally different story, right? We're not drinking this water, we're inhaling it and getting a pneumonia type of disease, right? So cough, fever, aches in the chest, those kind of things. I'm not going to say anything more about this because it's not usually involved with drinking water. It's usually involved with people who haven't cleaned their hot tubs, or like I said, sometimes you have large buildings, and I don't really know a lot about how air conditioning units work. But I guess in large buildings, they have cooling towers on the top of the building in many cases that can create mists. And so sometimes you're actually looking at these buildings and the mist is created and people just walking by on the street can get infected. So it's not super common, but there are outbreaks from time to time. And in fact, it may be more common, at least in Canada and the US, than your typical drinking water diseases. So there are a whole bunch of bacterial organisms out there that are at least worth mentioning that can cause waterborne diseases. A big one that's really important, but just not important in Canada, is cholera. So this organism is called Vibrio cholera. Vibrio, by the way, means you have an organism that sort of has it's sort of a bent rod. So it kind of looks like that. A normal rod-shaped organism looks like this. This one is sort of curved and bent, and very serious in some places in the world in terms of outbreaks. It's in India happen all the time. There was a major outbreak in Haiti during the earthquake 10 years ago, and so on. I'm not going to say too much about this other than it causes diarrhea. Probably no surprise there. All these organisms seem to cause diarrhea because they're messing around with your digestive tract. And this one here can be serious. People can actually get dehydrated and die within 24 hours. So here's a whole bunch on here. You can see there's Campylobacter, there's other Vibrio organisms and whatnot. And you can see I've got highlighted diarrhea, 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 vomiting, 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 and then anything else that's kind of related. I'm just going to mute you for a second here. Hold on. I just need to deal with something. All right, sorry about that. I'm just, my son is at home again today. The day home had some illness, so he couldn't go there. And so I'm stuck with him at home today, and he was asking me something about his lunch. Anyway, like I said, there's a whole bunch of bacterial organisms out there. And kind of the common theme here is that they cause, if they're drinking water contamination, you're looking at diarrhea, vomiting, sometimes other symptoms, fevers, abdominal pains, and a variety of other things. But the ones to know really are E. coli is a big one to know because it is pretty common for people to get traveler's diarrhea. And these ones with stars are kind of the ones that I spent a little bit more time talking about, so it's worth knowing a little bit about them. Here's a graph. I was trying to find one that was relevant to Canada, but I couldn't find any ones in Canada that had Legionella on it. So I'm assuming Canada and the US are pretty similar, but you can see the types of outbreaks, right? Legionella is kind of the big one here. Legionella is the big one here. And then you have all these non-Legionella bacteria over there. And then there are other causes, and we're going to talk about some of those ones now, particularly focus on the important ones. This is showing in terms of the symptoms. So if you have Legionella, you're getting respiratory symptoms like pneumonia. Everything else, it's usually some sort of gastrointestinal illness, such as vomiting and diarrhea. Okay, so we're going to switch gears, and we're going to talk about protozoans. Not sure how much David goes into this in Biology 108, but it's worth it defining what a protozoan is. So protozoan is a eukaryote, right? So these are eukaryotes, that's worth it mentioning. So that means they have a nucleus. And most of them are single-celled. And that's mostly what we can say about protists. We can say that they're not animals, they are not plants, they are not fungi. So in some ways, it's kind of a protist is a catch-all phrase that means everything else that's a eukaryote. A protozoan, as opposed to a protist, usually means it's what we would say animal-like. And what does that mean? Often it means it's aquatic and can swim around. Animals move and these things can move. And so that's kind of where the idea comes from. It's sort of an older term, and biologists aren't using the word protozoan so much anymore. But in the medical community, the word protozoan is stuck. So when we talk about getting a parasite, if you go and travel abroad and you get a parasite, it could be a protozoan parasite. So anyway, a lot of these things are feeders. They can feed on things in the wild, in the environment, and a lot of these are also parasites. Some do a little bit of both. The three that are worth mentioning and are all common in Canada are these three here. And so I'll talk a little bit about each of these here. So we've got Giardia, Cryptosporidium, and Entamoeba. And all three of these, unfortunately, can form something called cysts. So the word cyst is really just kind of means a lump. So they form lumps, but what do those lumps do? Well, these cysts, which are part of their life cycle, are resistant states. They're kind of like a sleeping state, and they're unfortunately resistant to chlorination. So that means if you have a whole bunch of Giardia at the water treatment plant, chlorination may not do anything to these things because they're resistant. So so that's a problem. So if you've ever had a boil water advisory in any community, which most communities have them from time to time for various reasons, it's because of suspected or possible contamination from one of these things. So let's talk about these in a little bit more detail here. This is supposed to be a video. It's not playing for you. That's unfortunate. Let's talk about the Giardia first. So Giardia is, its full name is Giardia lamblia. It has a few other names. Sometimes it's called Giardia intestinalis. And the common name for this, you can see, is Beaver Fever. So in Alberta, we're looking at a few hundred cases every year, and it is from contamination, usually from animal feces. I don't know whether beavers are the most common carrier of it or not, but it could be several types of animals: bears, dogs, beavers. Pretty much any mammal can be the culprit, but you're looking at kind of that theme where you have feces, and that gets in the water, and that leads to, you guessed it, vomiting or diarrhea. In this case, it's usually diarrhea. So notice this organism is kind of interesting. It has two nuclei and multiple flagella. I think it looks a little bit like an alien. I think I have another picture of one there. There's another image of one there on the right. Like I said, they're very cool looking, like aliens. So let's just take a quick look at this life cycle here. So notice we have these, here's our contaminated water. We'll start right there. The human drinks the water. And inside the water are these cysts here. So these are the cysts, right? Like I say, you can think of them as lumps, and they help this organism to survive outside of animals, and just they're sort of dormant. They get into the human gut, and they grow into these alien type things that are called trophozoites, and they have the two nuclei and all the flagella so they can swim around. Eventually they get pooped out, and they turn into cysts in the environment, and the cycle kind of repeats in on itself. So Giardia, this is the one. We're talking about diarrhea, and if you get diarrhea and it's 2 weeks or more, then it's probably Giardia. Okay, so if you go traveling somewhere, or if you go camping and you're drinking water out of the river, you know, I do it all the time. I've never had this. I'm not saying don't drink from the river, but do just be cautious sometimes of your water sources, right? Generally, if water sources smell bad, it's probably a good sign that you shouldn't drink it without putting in iodine tablets or anything like that. But yeah, if you get diarrhea and it's 2 to 3 days and it's done, that's probably E. coli or something else, Campylobacter or whatever. If it's 2 weeks or more, you're probably going to have. I'm hoping that by that point you've gone in to see the doctor, and it's probably Giardia. Here's some more pictures of Giardia. I think it's a kind of, like I said, kind of a really cool looking organism. In some ways, a little creepy with those eyeballs looking at you. And was looking for some pictures of Giardia, and somebody made a Halloween costume. So what a surprise. There's always a fan of something out there. But anyway, thought that one was interesting. One area that maybe more people are familiar with Giardia is actually Giardia and their pets. So this is pretty common in Canada. We have the spring melt. So you can imagine all winter long, you've got animals all over the place doing their thing and, you know, pooping everywhere. And in the spring, you know, everything melts and it takes the feces and it's going to, you know, move the feces into puddles or ponds. And then, you know, you're bringing your dog for a walk and the dog is drinking out of that. And then your dog gets diarrhea. And so this is something that's pretty common in dogs in particular, but other pets that get Giardia. So again, you know, you have your pet and it's had diarrhea for a prolonged period, there's a good chance it's Giardia, and you should probably get some drugs to help your dog with that. Okay, so that's Giardia, also known as beaver fever. Number 2 is Entamoeba. So this is an amoeba. So amoebas are famous for being kind of blob-shaped organisms, right? They usually look like this, nucleus, and they can move around from by changing the shape of their cell membrane. They can sort of crawl around by, you know, they're these blobs and they move around and change their shape. So that's what an amoeba is. And this is a particular amoeba called Entamoeba histolytica. The disease is called Amoebic Dysentery. So dysentery, I'll put it down there because there's room, basically means bloody diarrhea. So that's what that is. This is something that you may have heard of people in the world wars. They're in the trenches and they're getting dysentery there, and that's what that is. It's bloody diarrhea. It's no fun at all. Not much else to say about this. I'm not sure how many cases in Alberta annually. I think it's maybe half the amount of Giardia. Same idea. We can get it from animals, and people might get it from you know, camping or drinking water sources out in the wild. And you know, and kind of really the same story, except for in this case, you're not ending up with prolonged diarrhea, but bloody diarrhea, which is certainly maybe even less fun than the normal type of diarrhea. Not like that any diarrhea is fun at all. Anyway, moving on. Oh yeah, here's a video. Let's see if this one plays for us. No, what's wrong with my videos today? I was going to show you this amoeba moving around. Let me see if I can find that video. It's pretty cool. Hold on a second here. I gotta just go to my files. I bet you I have that video. It's very cool. Lectures, where is it? Oh, where is it? Let me try that file there. Oh yes, I found it. So let me just share my screen. I'll show you this this amoeba. Uh-oh, where is it now? Hold on, I think you can see that. There's just something weird going on with Zoom. Can't seem to find the, sorry, hold on, just bear with me. Zoom is doing something weird on my end. Okay, I will just share my screen and hopefully that works. I'm going to play this for you. Here it goes. There's the amoeba. I'm hoping you can see that it's changing the shape of its cytoplasm there. Apologize if you can't see it. I'm not sure what Zoom is doing for me. I can only see certain applications that are open up for some reason. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. There's a little cartoon for you. Gary Larson does the Far Side cartoon, one of my favorites. You can see they're in a lab. He's always making fun of scientists. He says, "What? The lemonade? This is lemonade. Where's my culture of amoebic dysentery?" Right? So, you know, again, never eat in the lab. You never know what somebody has waiting there for you. Okay, so the last one that is worth mentioning is this one here, Cryptosporidium. And Cryptosporidium, same thing. We're talking about animal feces. getting into a water supply. And this one is a bit more associated with cattle. And of course, Alberta has a lot of cows, right? Who knows, maybe even more cows in Alberta than humans. I'm not sure about that, but we do have a lot of cows. And cow manure can get into water and can infect people. And you can see they're kind of putting this implication between somebody being in a recreational swim. So this has happened. I don't know how common it is, but a child or an adult, I suppose, with Cryptosporidium, again, it's the same idea, right? You get this organism in you and you get diarrhea, right? And of course, somebody's in a swimming pool and you have an organism that is resistant to chlorination, right? And so apparently this has happened. Like I said, I don't know how common, but somebody has their diarrhea in a public swimming pool. And of course, this is giving the chance for other people to ingest it. So do never, ever, ever drink the water in a public swimming pool. Please don't do that. Like I said, I don't know how common it is, but there have been cases associated with that. I think it's a lot less common than people might think, but it is possible. So Cryptosporidium, same idea. You've got a chlorine-resistant cyst, gets into the drinking water, and people get diarrhea. So you may need a boil water advisory if it gets into your water. So there is one other group of parasites that are worth mentioning. Again, this is something that is not necessarily relevant to Canada. These are the helminths. So helminth is a word that basically means parasitic worm. And there's a whole bunch of these out there, lots of really weird ones. You can see this is kind of showing a generic life cycle of these things, and they're called, the family of these are called Schistosomes. So there's different ways to get them. Sometimes it has to do with eating undercooked fish or, something like that. And these organisms, I'm not going to ask you about them on a test, which is why I'm not getting into a lot of details. And usually these things, again, you've got a human and is pooping out the eggs, and these things hatch and they infect snails. You can see there's some snails there, right? And they break out of the snails and they form this little larva, and this larva kind of goes and finishes the life cycle, right? Usually it's a snail fish kind of thing, and the humans are sort of accidental hosts because of eating the raw fish or something like that. There's a whole bunch of these out here. Most of them are not relevant to Canada, which is, but if you hear about these things, they are, and then that's what they're about. There are a bunch of other ones out there that are kind of worth mentioning. If you're looking for an interesting one, read about the guinea worm. It's kind of an interesting worm. And most of these are geographically isolated to tropical or subtropical areas. And so there's a saying about what is a cure for tropical diseases: winter. And Canada, well, as you know, we have a lot of winter. So we're not concerned about most of these things. The one that is relevant is this one here in Canada. And this is the one that causes swimmer's itch. So let's talk about that for a minute. So swimmer's itch is caused by schistosome. That's one of these worms. And this is a duck snail thing that's going on, right? So you can see there's the duck, and the duck, number one here, it poops out the eggs. The eggs hatch, and they're eaten by the snail, and then the parasite is in the snail. It breaks out of the snail and swims along, and literally what it does is it will actually penetrate the duck's skin. And that's how it gets into the duck. And then the duck gets infected, and the eggs and the feces, and it's duck, snail, right? Sometimes, if you are a human, you might go swimming at the lake or the beach or whatever. And well, you know what? Ducks are everywhere. Don't think that some lakes have swimmer's itch and some don't. They probably all do, because there are ducks all over Canada. Just sometimes, there's more ducks and more swimmer's itch, and that's I think when the summers are a little bit warmer, sometimes it's a little bit more frequent. And so the ducks poop, the snails are there, and these little parasites, they swim along and they're looking for a duck. And then they find some skin, and they're like, yay, I found a duck. And no, they didn't find a duck. They found a human leg. And the parasite actually dies. It can't survive for very long outside of the duck or the snail. But in the human, what happens? Well, we get itchy. And some people get rashes. Some people are allergic to the parasites and they get violent allergic reactions or rashes. So I've had this myself, not recently, but I've had it at least a couple of times that I can recall. One time it was like, I must have been about 12 or 14, I can't remember. And I remember my mom made me an oatmeal bath. So apparently that helps with itching, and it wasn't a big deal. I remember I was fine kind of the next day, just really itchy the one day. The other time I had, I was a lot itchier. I remember going to the pharmacy and getting some sort of anti-itch lotion. But I never had like that person on the right, that violent allergic reaction. Thankfully, I'm very happy about that. Nobody likes to be itchy. Okay, so that's kind of the one parasitic worm to know a little bit about for this class. Like I said, there are a bunch of other parasites out there that are waterborne, and you can look them up if you want. Toxoplasma is more associated with cat litter than water, but it can be spread by water and so on. But I'm not going to focus in on any of those at all. So I do want to talk a little bit about viruses. And of course, everyone seems to know a little bit about viruses suddenly this past year. There's a handful of waterborne viruses that are worth talking about. And kind of the same idea is that many of them are causing our favorite symptoms, diarrhea and vomiting. There's two here that are most worth it to talk about, and the two that I will probably ask you about in this course are hepatitis A and norovirus. The other ones we're not going to worry about. So let's talk about these a little bit. Hepatitis A, HAV, is another pathogen that is associated with water sanitation. So if you take a look at this, this is almost the exact same map I showed you with traveler's diarrhea. We're looking at, for the most part, Western wealthy countries with good sanitation, not a big deal. And, other countries, a little bit more of a big deal. I'm not sure what's going on in Greenland or the Scandinavian countries. It looks like they're a little bit more worse off than they're not in the green zone. Well, maybe that Scandinavian countries are very low. I didn't realize that was another color of orange there. Kind of weird they have that. They should have done dark green. But yeah, we're looking at areas of good water sanitation. So not usually many outbreaks in Canada. It happens once in a while. Again, you've got that situation where sometimes you have contaminated food products. There was an outbreak not too long ago. I can't remember whether it was in Canada or in the US, and it was tracked down to contaminated onions, I think it was, or something like that, green onions. And, it's just water contaminated with feces. That's what we're talking about here. What are the symptoms, right? Like I said, diarrhea, vomiting, those kind of things. Hepatitis means that it's infecting the liver. So sometimes people get a little bit of jaundice and things like that, and fever and whatnot. Hepatitis A, for most people, is nothing to be worried about. It sucks getting sick, but this is something that your body will heal of and get better. It's also preventable by vaccine. There's a traveler's vaccine for hepatitis A. So if you do traveling to a warmer place, such as Mexico or something like that, sometimes they recommend you get your hepatitis A shot, and it will protect you against getting sick. But like I said, not usually a big deal. A lot of people are a little bit more familiar with hepatitis B and C. There's a whole bunch of hepatitises, by the way. And one thing to say is they are different viruses and different causes. Hepatitis B, for example, is usually spread by sexual contact and intravenous drug use. It's a little more like HIV and AIDS. Very different disease, and much more serious and chronic. But hepatitis A is not usually so serious. Okay, so more vomiting and diarrhea, unfortunately. This one is more the vomiting than the diarrhea, but it's all kind of the same part of the body, unfortunately. All right, so the other virus that is worth mentioning is norovirus. This one goes by a whole bunch of names. It used to be called the Norwalk virus, but the people of Norwalk, Connecticut did not like that fact that a virus was named after their town. So they asked it to be renamed. Goes by a whole bunch of names: winter vomiting bug. Sometimes people call it the daycare bug or something like that, because it's famous for going through daycares and nursing homes. Sometimes people call it the stomach flu. It's not the flu, A flu is a respiratory virus, but anyway, it's something, a name that's stuck, and I don't think it's going away. You can see here, what's the difference, right? Norovirus, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, stomach cramps, all those kind of things. Influenza, cough, sore throat, you know, those kind of things, headaches, chills, and whatnot. So just something that I like to tell people about, because a lot of people seem to get the flu mixed up with stomach infections, which are entirely different things. So yeah, you don't want it. I've, in jokes, called this sometimes the 2-bucket flu. So I think you can probably picture that right here, right now, what I mean by 2 buckets. Usually people get sick, they get violently sick for, you know, kind of 24 hours is pretty typical kind of thing. And this thing is extremely infectious, very, very, very infectious. You know, one kid in a daycare gets it, and then everyone in the daycare gets it. It spreads through nursing homes and cruise ships, and it sucks. There's no prevention other than hygiene, and there's no vaccine for it, and the treatment is just go home, rest, and keep hydrated. So it really sucks, but it's one of those things that maybe someday we'll figure out what to deal with this kind of thing. Yeah, that's norovirus. Lots of fun. There's a little infographic. It says, "Norovirus, stop the spread." You know, if you have an outbreak, please stay at home and get better. And you should be symptom-free for at least 48 hours, which is usually what a lot of daycares do in schools. They say if you have, you know, vomiting or diarrhea, please be well for at least 48 hours before you return. Probably a good idea, right? We don't want to stop the spread. Like I said, there's lots of other viruses we could talk about. We could talk about rotaviruses and polio and hepatitis E and those kind of things, but we're not going to. So I want you to know about hepatitis A and norovirus, right? Those are the 2 that I want you to know about. Okay, just doing a time check here, 1:47. Maybe I'll finish off on this slide here and just say there's a lot of variables around diseases. And you've probably learned a little bit about, you know, with this current pandemic in terms of things like the incubation period and those kind of things. And some diseases are a lot more infectious than others. And there's some of the some of the variables there. So kind of finishing off here, sort of some of the things to summarize waterborne diseases is the major symptoms: diarrhea and nausea and related things. So stomach cramps, sometimes blood in the diarrhea, sometimes fevers, those kind of things. And the causes, we're talking about fecal contamination of the water supply. And if you remember, we talked about this last day. When we talk about fecal contamination, there's 3 main sources. Number 1 is humans. Number 2 is our livestock, so agricultural runoff. And 3 is, of course, wild animals. And depending on the circumstance, one of those things may be more important than the other. In Canada, human contamination from human feces is very, very rare because we have water treatment. It's more likely to be agricultural runoff. In some cities, they're worried about the wildlife getting their poop into the water supply and so on. Okay, so I think that is where we will finish off for today. And I guess I'll see everybody tomorrow morning for lab 3. And we'll be doing that in the environmental lab. So make sure you come to the environmental lab. Don't forget your lab coat and your goggles. And we'll see you there.